If you sing in Italian, I'll marry you." The Mafia boss laughed, holding a microphone toward the maid accused of stealing his dead mother's jewels in front of 400 of the most powerful criminals in America. Cruel laughter rippled through the grand ballroom like poison spreading through water. But when she opened her mouth to sing, the silence that followed would expose secrets 20 years buried. And nothing would ever be the same. The Romano estate in the heart of Manhattan blazed with a brilliance that could rival the sun itself. Every Murano glass chandelier dripped with light as if heaven had been purchased and installed across the vaulted ceilings. 400 guests, dressed in the kind of elegance that only generations of old money and rivers of blood money could buy. Raised crystal flutes filled with champagne worth more than a year's salary for most Americans. Their laughter echoed against marble columns imported from Carrara. Their jewelry caught the light like captured stars. This was the engagement celebration of Dante Romano, the man they called Il Giudice, the judge, the 34-year-old head of the most powerful crime family on the East Coast. His empire stretched across 12 states, his influence reaching into boardrooms, courthouses, and the darkest corners where justice never penetrated. His face was carved from granite and ambition, his dark eyes calculating every angle, every threat, every opportunity. Those eyes had watched empires rise and fall, had witnessed betrayals and executions, and tonight they watched his carefully arranged future unfold before him. He was engaged to Valentina Castelli, daughter of the Chicago Syndicate, a marriage that would unite two criminal dynasties and cement his power for decades to come. It should have been perfect. But amidst all that glittering darkness, there was someone who did not belong to this world of silk and sin. Isabella Romano moved between the guests like a ghost, her red and white maid's uniform a stark contrast to the designer gowns that swept past her. She carried a silver tray of champagne flutes, her movements precise in practice, her face carefully blank. She had learned long ago that the best way to survive in this house was to become invisible, never meet anyone's eyes, never speak unless spoken to, never exist beyond her function as a servant. But Isabella was no ordinary maid. She had been working in this mansion for 7 years. Ever since she was 19 years old, watching, learning, documenting. Every conversation she overheard was memorized. Every face she served was catalogued. Every weakness in the Romano security was noted and filed away in her perfect memory. The other servants thought she was saving money for her dying mother's hospital bills. The family thought she was just another faceless worker, grateful for employment. No one knew the truth. No one knew that her real name was Isabella Messina, daughter of Lucia Messina, the opera singer whose voice had once graced the stages of La Scala and the Metropolitan Opera. The woman whose career had been destroyed, whose spirit had been broken, whose life had ended in a morphine haze just 3 months ago, all because she had refused to become the mistress of Dante's father, Antonio Romano. Isabella had been 8 years old when her mother came home from that fateful performance, her beautiful face swollen and bruised, her hands shaking as she packed their few belongings. They had run that night, but you can't outrun men like the Romanos. The blacklisting came first. No opera house would hire Lucia Messina. Then came the debts, manufactured and multiplied. Then came the poverty that ground them down year after year. And through it all, Lucia had whispered to her daughter, "Your voice is your weapon, Isabella. Hide it. Protect it. And when the time comes, use it to burn their world to ashes." For 7 years, Isabella had been a shadow in the Romano mansion. 7 years of silence and swallowed rage. 7 years of getting close to the enemy, learning his patterns, understanding his empire. No family to hold her back anymore. No other options, no other purpose. Just revenge, cold and patient as winter. Tonight that patience would be tested in ways she never imagined. If this story grips your soul, let me know in the comments and share it with someone who loves tales of vengeance and redemption. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter, because in the next part, the accusation comes, the challenge is issued, and Isabella will have to decide if she's ready to reveal the weapon she's hidden for 2 decades. That night, there was a moment Isabella never saw coming. As she moved through the center of the grand ballroom, weaving between clusters of criminals dressed as aristocrats, her gaze caught on something that made her heart stop. Hanging on the far wall, positioned directly behind where Dante stood receiving congratulations from his guests, was a massive oil painting in an ornate golden frame. The painting showed a woman in a flowing gown caught mid-area, her mouth open in song, her dark hair streaming like smoke. The brushstrokes captured motion and music frozen in oil and canvas. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. It was her mother, Lucia Messina, painted at the height of her fame. 25 years ago when she was the rising star of the opera world. Isabella recognized the dress, the emerald gown Lucia wore for her debut at the Met. She recognized the expression, that transcendent moment when a singer becomes more than human, becomes pure emotion and sound. Isabella couldn't understand why this painting hung in the enemy's mansion. He had Antonio Romano commissioned it when he was obsessed with her mother. Was it a trophy, a reminder of what he'd destroyed? Or something darker, a possession of what he could never truly have? The questions burned through her mind, and for just a few seconds, Isabella forgot her training. She forgot to be invisible. She stared at her mother's face painted in beauty and triumph before everything fell apart. Only a few seconds. Isabella looked for only a few seconds, her mask slipping just enough to show the pain beneath. But those few seconds were enough. Marcella Romano had seen everything. Dante's cousin stood near the chocolate fountain, a glass of Barolo wine in her perfectly manicured hand, her lips curving into a smile that belonged on a viper. Marcella had hated Isabella from the moment she'd arrived at the estate 7 years ago, and she hated how Isabella endured every petty cruelty and deliberate slight without breaking. She hated how the girl's dark eyes seemed to hold secrets Marcella couldn't uncover. She hated how even in a cheap uniform, Isabella carried herself with a dignity that made Marcella's designer wardrobe feel insufficient. And more than anything, Marcella hated that she owed the Genovese family $3 million in gambling debts that were due in 48 hours. The ruby necklace, Antonio Romano's final gift to his late wife before she died, had been absurdly easy to steal from the family vault. Marcella had the codes, the access, the opportunity. But she needed a scapegoat, someone to take the fall when the theft was discovered. Someone disposable, someone no one would believe or defend. Someone like a maid who'd just been caught staring at the boss with an expression that looked almost personal. Marcella slipped through the crowd like poison through veins, her heels clicking against marble as she approached her cousin. She leaned in close, her perfume cloying and sweet, and whispered into Dante's ear with a voice full of manufactured concern. "Dante, darling, I hate to interrupt your celebration, but we have a serious problem." Dante had been discussing shipping routes with the Castells, sealing the final details of his engagement alliance. He was in no mood for Marcella's drama. His cousin had a talent for creating chaos, usually when she wanted money or attention. "This better be important, Marcella." "Oh, it is." Marcella's eyes glittered with malicious delight. "You know that necklace? Your mother's ruby necklace? The one worth $3 million? The one you promised would be Valentina's engagement gift?" Dante's expression went cold as ice. "What about it?" "It's missing from the vault, and I know who took it." The temperature in Dante's immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. Several nearby guests unconsciously stepped back, recognizing the shift in his demeanor. When Il Giudice went cold, people died. "Who?" The word came out like a death sentence waiting for a name. Marcella smiled and pointed across the ballroom toward Isabella, who had resumed her duties, head bowed, trying to disappear into the background near a marble column. "The maid, Isabella Romano, though I doubt that's even her real name. I've had my suspicions about her for months. Too quiet, too watchful. So I had security search the servants' quarters an hour ago." Marcella pulled out her phone, showing Dante a photograph. "Look what they found wrapped in her spare uniform." The photograph showed the necklace, a cascade of Burmese rubies set in platinum, each stone the color of fresh blood, partially hidden in a bundle of fabric on a narrow bed. Dante stared at the image, his jaw clenching. His mother had worn that necklace on her wedding day. It was one of the few pieces of sentiment he allowed himself to keep, and now a maid had stolen it, had dared to take something precious from him in his own house during his own engagement party. "Bring her here," Dante said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded violence. "Now." Marcella's smile widened. "With pleasure." She signaled to 2 security guards, massive men in dark suits with the dead eyes of professional enforcers. They began moving through the crowd toward Isabella. Isabella sensed them before she saw them. Some survival instinct, honed through years of living in the Romano mansion, made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She turned and saw the 2 guards approaching, their expressions blank but purposeful. Her heart began to pound. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not tonight. Not before she was ready. But she didn't run. Where could she run when this entire world was her prison? When she'd spent 7 years building this cover, this position, this opportunity? Running would destroy everything. The guard seized Isabella by both arms, and the silver tray slipped from her fingers. Crystal champagne flutes shattered against the marble floor with a sound like breaking bones. Golden liquid spread across white stone and guests jumped back, their conversations dying mid-sentence. But no one looked at the mess. Every pair of eyes in that ballroom fixed on the small maid being dragged through the crowd like a criminal bound for execution. Isabella didn't fight. She learned long ago that resistance only made everything worse in this world. But her mind was racing, calculating, trying to understand what was happening. She hadn't stolen anything. She never took risks, never drew attention. What had changed? What had she done wrong? When they reached the raised platform where the 10-piece orchestra had been playing soft classical music, Dante lifted one hand in a simple gesture. The music stopped mid-note. Gasped the sudden silence dropping over the ballroom like a suffocating blanket. 400 guests turned their heads, curious and hungry, like sharks scenting blood in the water. They knew when Il Giudice stopped the party, something memorable was about to happen. Isabella was shoved up the 3 steps leading to the platform. She stumbled but caught herself, refusing to fall, refusing to give them that satisfaction. She could feel 400 pairs of eyes on her, could feel the weight of their judgment and anticipation. Dante stepped in front of her, and up close he was even more imposing, 6 feet. 2 inches of controlled power and cold authority. His shadow seemed to swallow her, seemed to eclipse everything else in her vision. Ladies and gentlemen, Dante's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Yeah, I apologize for interrupting the celebration, but a matter of family honor has come to my attention that requires immediate resolution. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. They knew that tone. They knew what matters of family honor meant in this world. Isabella stood perfectly still, her hands clenched at her sides. Her face a careful mask of confusion and fear. Inside, her mind was working furiously. She didn't know what this was about, but she knew it was bad. Dante Romano didn't drag servants onto a stage in front of 400 witnesses unless he planned to make an example of them. Dante turned slightly, addressing the crowd while keeping Isabella in his peripheral vision. This is Isabella Romano. No relation, despite the unfortunate coincidence of names. His voice dripped with contempt. She's been a maid in the Romano household for 7 years. She cleans our rooms, washes our clothes, serves our food. Each word felt like a lash against Isabella's dignity, but she kept her expression neutral, her eyes downcast. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. And apparently, Dante continued, his voice growing colder, she also steals priceless family heirlooms. Gas rippled through the crowd. Valentina Castelli, Dante's bride-to-be, leaned forward with interest. The older dons exchanged knowing glances. Everyone understood what came next in these situations. Isabella's head snapped up, her eyes meeting Dante's for the first time. I didn't. Silence. The word cracked like a whip and Isabella's mouth closed. She saw something dangerous flickering in Dante's dark eyes. Something that told her speaking without permission would only make things infinitely worse. Marcella stepped onto the platform, holding her phone up like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Security found this in her room an hour ago. She projected the photograph onto the large screen behind the orchestra, where everyone could see the ruby necklace nestled in cheap fabric. The crowd murmured, some with shock, others with excitement. This was better entertainment than they'd hoped for. Isabella stared at the image, her mind reeling. She'd never seen that necklace before. She'd never been in the family vault. This was a setup. A frame job, but who would do this to her, and why? Then she caught Marcella's expression, that smile of pure malicious satisfaction, and understood. Marcella had done this, but the why didn't matter now. Here, what mattered was survival. Dante pulled a microphone from the orchestra's lead singer, his movements deliberate and theatrical. He was enjoying this, Isabella realized. Or at least he was enjoying the power, the control, the reminder to everyone present that nothing escaped his judgment. That necklace, Dante said, his voice amplified now, filling every corner of the massive ballroom, belonged to my mother. It was her favorite piece. Worth $3 million, yes. But its sentimental value is beyond price. And this, he gestured dismissively at Isabella, this thief thought she could steal it, sell it, and disappear with my family's legacy around her neck. I didn't steal anything. Isabella's voice came out stronger than she intended, fueled by genuine outrage. 7 years of careful invisibility shattered in an instant. But she couldn't stay silent while being accused of a crime she didn't commit. The crowd went completely still. No one spoke to Il Giudice that way. No one contradicted him publicly. Dante's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Isabella saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or interest. He'd expected her to crumble, to beg, to sob. He hadn't expected defiance. "You dare to contradict me?" Dante stepped closer, close enough that Isabella could smell his cologne, something expensive and dark, like smoke and leather. "In my own house? In front of my guests?" Isabella's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, but she held his gaze. If she was going down, she wouldn't go down as a coward. "I dare to tell the truth. I've never stolen anything in my life. Like, I've worked for your family for 7 years without a single complaint or incident. Why would I risk everything for a necklace I couldn't possibly sell without being caught?" It was a good point, and Isabella saw several guests nodding slightly. But Dante wasn't interested in logic. He was interested in power, in control, in demonstrating what happened to those who challenged the Romano family. A slow, cold smile spread across Dante's face, and Isabella felt ice slide down her spine. "You want to prove your innocence?" Dante asked, his voice deceptively soft. "I'll give you a chance. One chance." He held up the microphone, letting it dangle between them like a poisoned apple. "You claim to be innocent. You claim to be honest. Fine, then prove it. Prove you're more than just a thief and a liar." Dante's smile widened, showing teeth. "If you can sing, really sing, not some pathetic attempt at karaoke. If you can sing a complete Italian aria in front of all these people, I'll believe you. I'll spare you. I'll even do you one better." He raised his voice, addressing the crowd now, turning this into a spectacle. "I'll marry you. Right here. Right now. This maid will become my wife instead of Valentina Castelli." The ballroom erupted. Valentina stood up, her face flushed with rage. The Castelli family delegation looked murderous. Marcella's smile faltered, realizing her plan had spun wildly out of control, and 400 guests began talking at once, shocked and delighted by this unexpected twist. But Isabella barely heard any of it. She stared at Dante, understanding dawning like terrible sunrise. He was playing a game. He expected her to fail. To humiliate herself trying to sing operatic arias she couldn't possibly know. And when she failed, he would have his justification to punish her publicly, to make an example that would remind every servant, every employee, every person in his organization what happened to thieves. Dante leaned in closer, speaking quietly so only Isabella could hear beneath the chaos of the crowd. "You can't sing, can you? You'll fail, and everyone will see you for the fraud you are, and then—" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Then I'll decide what happens to you. And I promise, it won't be quick." For 7 years, Isabella had hidden her greatest weapon. For 7 years, she'd kept silent, invisible, unremarkable. For 7 years, she'd waited for the perfect moment to strike at the family that destroyed her mother. This wasn't the moment she'd planned. This wasn't the careful, calculated revenge she'd spent so long preparing. But sometimes, Isabella realized, revolution doesn't wait for perfect timing. Sometimes you have to burn the world down right now or lose your chance forever. Isabella looked at the microphone, then at Dante's confident smirk, then at the 400 faces watching her with cruel anticipation, and then she smiled. A real smile, sharp as broken glass, full of secrets and the promise of destruction. "I accept," Isabella said clearly. "But when I sing, and when I prove you wrong, you will keep your promise. You will marry me, and I will be a Romano wife in every sense of the word." The double meaning hung in the air between them, invisible to the crowd but landing like a blade in the space between Isabella and Dante. His eyes widened slightly. He heard the threat beneath her words, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. "Choose your song," Dante said, handing her the microphone, still confident this would end in her humiliation. Isabella took the microphone, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She turned to Maestro Giuseppe, the elderly conductor who'd been with the Romano family for decades, who'd played for all their celebrations and all their funerals. "Maestro," Isabella said, her voice carrying across the now silent ballroom, "do you know, O mio babbino caro?" The maestro's face went pale, his hands, raised to conduct, began to tremble, because Maestro Giuseppe was old enough to remember, old enough to have played that exact aria 20 years ago for a singer named Lucia Messina. Old enough to recognize the bone structure of the young woman standing before him, the exact shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw. "See," he whispered, understanding that he was about to witness either a miracle or a reckoning, possibly both. He raised his baton and the orchestra began to play. And Isabella Messina, after 7 years of silence, after 20 years of hiding her mother's legacy, opened her mouth and prepared to burn the Romano Empire to ashes with nothing but her voice. The Romano Empire didn't announce itself with violence anymore. That was the old way, Antonio Romano's way, the way of broken kneecaps and bodies in the river, of fear so thick you could taste it like blood in your mouth. Dante had changed that when he took over 5 years ago, after his father's heart finally gave out from a lifetime of cigars and cruelty. Now the empire ran like a corporation, clean on the surface, with lawyers and legitimate businesses fronting the operations that happened in the shadows. Protection rackets had become security consulting firms. Loan sharking had evolved into private lending institutions. The violence still existed, but it was surgical now, precise, used only when absolutely necessary. Isabella had studied this transformation obsessively, and it terrified her more than the old brutality ever could. Her mother had been destroyed by a monster, by Antonio's crude obsession and vindictive rage. But Dante was something different. Dante was intelligent, controlled, almost principled in his own twisted way. He had rules. He kept his word, even to enemies. He'd executed 3 of his own men last year for touching a civilian woman without consent, calling it bad for business and beneath our standards. The criminal underworld whispered about Il Giudice with a mixture of fear and respect, because his judgments, while harsh, were considered fair by the standards of their world. It made Isabella's mission infinitely more complicated. She'd spent 7 years expecting to find a monster she could hate purely, completely. Instead, she'd found a man who read philosophy, who donated anonymously to children's hospitals, who'd abolished his father's human trafficking operations the moment he took power, calling them a stain on the family name. A man who was still a criminal, still dangerous, still responsible for countless crimes, but who operated under a code that made him unpredictable. As Isabella moved through the engagement celebration, serving champagne to politicians and judges on the Romano payroll, she watched Dante work the room with practiced ease. He laughed at the right moments, clasped shoulders with warmth that seemed almost genuine, listened intently when the Castelli patriarch spoke about their future alliance. He was building something, she realized. Not just maintaining his father's empire, but transforming it into something that could survive in the modern world, something that could eventually go legitimate entirely. And her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Burn it all down, Isabella. Promise me. But how do you burn down an empire that's already reforming itself? How do you destroy a man who's trying, in his own way, to be better than his father? Isabella pushed the doubt away as she refilled glasses and remained invisible. It didn't matter if Dante Romano was complex. It didn't matter if he had honor codes. He was still a Romano. His money still came from her mother's destruction, and tonight, whether he knew it or not, his careful control would shatter, and Isabella would finally begin the reckoning she promised at her mother's deathbed. Marcella Romano had been beautiful once, before the cocaine and the late nights and the crushing weight of being born into a family where women were decorations, not power players. She was 32 now, her beauty maintained through expensive procedures and careful lighting, her designer wardrobe hiding the desperation that gnawed at her like cancer. The Genovese family didn't care about her beauty or her last name. They cared about the $3 million she owed them, money she lost over 6 months of increasingly reckless baccarat games in their underground casino. They'd given her 48 hours to pay. After that, they'd given her a preview, a photograph of what they'd done to the last Romano who'd welched on a debt. The body had been found in pieces. The family vault had been absurdly easy to access. Dante trusted her. I trusted all his blood relatives with the codes and the access, believing that family loyalty was the one constant in their world of shifting alliances. He didn't know that Marcella had stopped being loyal the moment her addiction had become more powerful than her fear. The ruby necklace sat in its velvet case like a solution to all her problems. $3 million worth of Burmese rubies, each stone flawless, the platinum setting a masterwork of craftsmanship. Antonio had commissioned it for his wife on their 20th anniversary, one of the few genuine gestures of love the old monster had ever made. Marcella had slipped it into her Hermes bag during the afternoon, while the house was in chaos preparing for the engagement celebration. Security was focused on the perimeter, on the arriving guests. Not on family members moving freely through the mansion. The hard part wasn't stealing it. The hard part was making sure someone else took the fall. She'd watched Isabella for weeks, studying the maid's routines, her movements, her tiny room in the servants' quarters. The girl was too perfect, too quiet, too careful. It made Marcella suspicious. Normal people had tells, had weaknesses, had moments where their masks slipped. But Isabella moved through the mansion like a ghost, never complaining, never gossiping with other servants, never doing anything that might draw attention. It was unnatural, and it made her the perfect scapegoat. Planting the necklace had taken 30 seconds. Isabella's door didn't lock. Servants weren't allowed privacy in the Romano household. Marcella had wrapped the necklace in one of Isabella's spare uniforms and shoved it under the thin mattress, obvious enough to be found quickly but hidden enough to look like a genuine attempt at concealment. Then she'd made an anonymous call to security, suggesting they search the servants' quarters for stolen items, mentioning Isabella's name specifically, claiming she'd seen suspicious behavior. Now standing in the ballroom with her wine glass and her carefully applied smile, Marcella watched the celebration unfold and waited for her moment. The security search had been completed an hour ago. They'd found the necklace exactly where she'd planted it. They'd photographed it, documented it, and reported directly to her first, knowing she was family and would want to handle this delicately before informing Dante. Delicate. Marcella almost laughed. There was nothing delicate about what she was planning. She saw Isabella pause while serving canapés, saw the maid's eyes drift to that painting of the opera singer that Antonio had commissioned decades ago, saw something flicker across Isabella's carefully blank expression. Pain. Recognition. Something personal. And Marcella smiled because she'd just found her dramatic moment. She moved through the crowd like a serpent through grass, beautiful and venomous, heading straight for her cousin. Dante was about to toast his bride-to-be. 400 witnesses were assembled. The moment was perfect, time to burn the maid and save herself. Dante raised his crystal flute, the champagne catching the light from 1,000 candles as 400 guests fell silent in anticipation. Valentina Castelli stood beside him in a gown worth more than most people's cars, her smile perfect and practiced, the smile of a woman who'd been groomed since birth for exactly this kind of alliance. The marriage would unite the East Coast and Chicago operations, would create an empire that stretched from Boston to the Great Lakes. It was strategic, beneficial, and completely loveless, which made it perfect by the standards of their world. To family, Dante began, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. To tradition, to the future we build together. Dante, stop. Marcella's voice cut through the toast like a knife through silk. She pushed through the front row of guests, her face a careful mask of concern and distress. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have a crisis. A family crisis that can't wait. Dante's jaw tightened. He recognized his cousin's flair for drama, her need to be the center of attention, but something in her expression made him pause. Marcella looked genuinely upset, genuinely frightened. This better be important. Your mother's necklace is missing. Marcella let the words hang in the air like an executioner's blade. The ruby necklace, $3 million, gone from the vault. The ballroom erupted into whispers. Valentina's smile faltered. The older dons leaned forward with interest, recognizing the scent of blood in the water. Dante set his champagne down with careful precision, his expression going cold and flat. When? Discovered an hour ago during routine security checks. Marcella pulled out her phone, her hands shaking just enough to seem authentic. But I know who took it. I've suspected for weeks. That maid, Isabella Romano. I've seen her watching things, studying the house like she was planning something, so I had security search the servants' quarters. She projected the photograph onto the screen behind the orchestra. The image blazed across the white surface, the ruby necklace unmistakable in its beauty and value, wrapped in cheap fabric that was clearly a maid's uniform, lying on a narrow bed in a small bare room. The crowd's whispers turned to gasps, then to excited murmurs. This was better than any planned entertainment. Dante stared at the image, his face unreadable. His mother had worn that necklace on her wedding day, or had touched it like a talisman during her final months of cancer. It was one of the few pieces of his father's legacy that Dante had actually valued because it represented a moment when Antonio Romano had been capable of genuine love. Bring me the security footage, Dante said quietly, and bring me the maid. Now. The footage shows her entering and leaving her room multiple times today, Marcella said quickly, lying with the ease of long practice. She had opportunity, motive. These servants barely make minimum wage. $3 million would change her entire life. 2 security guards were already moving through the crowd toward Isabella, who stood frozen near a marble column, a tray of champagne flutes trembling in her hands. She saw them coming and understood with terrible clarity that something had gone catastrophically wrong. She hadn't stolen anything. She'd been so careful for 7 years, but the evidence was there. undeniable, damning. The guard seized her arms, and the tray crashed to the floor. Crystal shattered like ice, champagne spreading across marble like spilled blood, and 400 guests turned to watch as Isabella was dragged toward the platform where Dante stood, his expression cold as winter, his eyes promising judgment. The celebration had become a trial, and Isabella was the accused. Dante watched the maid's face as she was shoved onto the platform, looking for the telltale signs of guilt, the darting eyes, the trembling lips, the immediate collapse into begging and tears. He'd seen it 1,000 times before in men and women who'd stolen from the family, who'd betrayed their trust, who'd thought they could take what wasn't theirs and disappear into the night. They always broke the same way, predictable as sunrise. But Isabella Romano didn't break. She stood perfectly still, her hands clenched at her sides, her breathing controlled despite the fear he could see flickering in her dark eyes. There was something else there too, something he couldn't quite identify. Not just fear. Calculation. Like she was running numbers in her head, weighing options, making decisions at lightning speed. And it intrigued him more than it should have. "You understand what you've done?" Dante asked, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Stealing from this family, from me, on the night of my engagement." "I didn't steal anything," Isabella said, and her voice was steady, clear, lacking the desperate edge of a cornered liar. "I've worked here for 7 years without incident. Why would I risk everything now?" It was a good question. Dante had built his reputation on logic, on seeing patterns, on understanding motivation, and Isabella's supposed theft made no sense. A maid who'd been invisible for 7 years suddenly stealing the most recognizable piece of jewelry in the house, hiding it poorly in her own room on a night when security was at its highest. Either she was monumentally stupid, or something else was happening here. But Marcella had evidence, and 400 witnesses were watching. And Dante's authority depended on swift public justice. He could have her arrested, could have her questioned in the basement rooms where the family handled such matters privately, could make this disappear with a phone call and a body that would never be found. But something about Isabella's defiant stare made him pause, made him want to see what she would do when pushed to the absolute edge. "You want to prove your innocence?" Dante said slowly, an idea forming that was either brilliant or completely insane. "I'll give you one chance, one test." He took the microphone from the orchestra's lead singer, letting it dangle between them like an offer and a threat. "Sing for me, a complete Italian aria, not some pop song. Not some simple melody. A real opera piece performed properly in front of all these people." He smiled cold and sharp. "If you can do that, if you can prove you have that kind of training, that kind of background, the kind of education that makes you more than just a common thief, then I'll believe you're innocent." The crowd leaned forward, fascinated. This was unprecedented, bizarre, entertaining. "And if I do?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I sing, and you believe me, what then?" Dante's smile widened, enjoying the absurdity of what he was about to say, the way it would shock his bride-to-be and scandalize the entire gathering. "Then I'll marry you instead of Valentina Castelli. Right here, right now, a maid becomes a queen. How's that for incentive?" The ballroom exploded into chaos, Valentina screaming, the Castellis rising from their seats, Marcella's face going pale with shock. But Isabella barely heard any of it, because she was calculating. 7 years of patience, of planning, of waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the family that destroyed her mother. This wasn't the moment she planned, but Dante had just offered her something she could never have achieved on her own: instant access to the inner circle, to his trust, to his vulnerabilities. All she had to do was reveal the weapon she'd hidden for 20 years. Her mother's voice from that final hospital bed. "Your voice is your vengeance, Isabella." Isabella looked at the microphone, then at Dante's confident smirk, then at 400 faces waiting for her humiliation. "I accept," she said clearly, "and when I prove you wrong, you'll keep your promise." Isabella took the microphone from Dante's hand, her fingers brushing against his for just a moment. The contact sent electricity through the space between them, a charge that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with power, recognizing power, predator sensing predator. She held his gaze, refusing to look away first, refusing to show the fear that was screaming through her nervous system like wildfire. "If I sing," Isabella said clearly, her voice amplified now so every guest could hear, "and if you marry me as promised, I will be a true Romano wife in every way. I will stand beside you. I will learn your world. I will become part of this family completely." The crowd heard a desperate woman trying to negotiate terms for her survival. They heard ambition, perhaps, or the naive hope of a servant girl dreaming of rising above her station. But Dante heard something else entirely. He heard the emphasis on every way, heard the promise that sounded more like a threat. He saw something flicker in Isabella's eyes, something dark and purposeful that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. For just a moment, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake, if this simple test had somehow opened a door he didn't fully understand. Then Isabella turned away from him, breaking the moment, and addressed the orchestra's conductor with a calm that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "Maestro Giuseppe," she said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "Do you know O mio babbino caro from Gianni Schicchi?" The maestro's face drained of color like someone had opened a vein. His baton, raised and ready, began to tremble in his aged hands. He stared at Isabella as if seeing a ghost, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Because Giuseppe Moretti had been playing piano in New York's opera houses for 50 years, he'd accompanied hundreds of singers, thousands of performances. But he would never forget the night 20 years ago when he'd played for Lucia Messina at a private performance for Antonio Romano. He'd watched the most beautiful voice he'd ever heard reject the most dangerous man in New York. He'd seen what happened to Lucia afterward, the blacklisting, the destruction, the slow death of a career that should have conquered the world. And now, standing before him, was a young woman with Lucia's exact bone structure, Lucia's dark eyes, Lucia's proud bearing, even in a servant's uniform. Asking for the same aria Lucia had sung that fatal night. "Maestro?" Isabella prompted gently, though her heart was hammering. She was gambling everything on this moment, on the chance that someone in this room would remember, would recognize, would understand what she was really doing. Giuseppe's hands steadied as understanding flooded through him. This wasn't just a performance. This was a resurrection. This was vengeance wrapped in music. "Si, signorina," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I know it well." He turned to his orchestra, and though his hands still trembled, his voice rang clear. "Gianni Schicchi, O mio babbino caro," in the key of F, as written, and play it as if your lives depend on it, because perhaps they do. The musicians exchanged confused glances but lifted their instruments. Giuseppe raised his baton. Chas met Isabella's eyes one final time, seeing in her gaze both Lucia's ghost and something fiercer, something that had survived when Lucia had not, and brought it down. The first notes of the aria filled the ballroom like a benediction, like a requiem, like the opening bars of a war that had been waiting 20 years to begin. The introduction flowed from the orchestra like honey and heartbreak, the strings carrying a melody so achingly beautiful that conversations died mid-sentence across the ballroom. Maestro Giuseppe conducted with his eyes closed, remembering another performance, another woman, another night when this exact music had changed everything. His fingers moved through the air with the muscle memory of 2 decades, but his mind was in the past, in a smaller venue where Antonio Romano had sat in the front row, obsessed and possessive, watching Lucia Messina sing with a hunger that had nothing to do with art and everything to do with ownership. Lucia had chosen this aria deliberately that night, a daughter's plea to her father, begging him to let her marry the man she loves, promising she would throw herself into the river if he refused. The lyrics were about love and desperation, but Lucia had sung them as a warning to Antonio, a musical rejection wrapped in Puccini's genius. Antonio hadn't understood until the performance ended and Lucia had walked out of his life, refusing his offers, his threats, his money. Giuseppe had played the final notes that night, knowing he was witnessing the end of something, though he hadn't known then just how complete that destruction would be. Within months, Lucia Messina couldn't book a church basement, let alone an opera house. Within years, the greatest voice of her generation had been silenced by poverty and broken dreams. Now 20 years later, Giuseppe watched Isabella stand at the microphone with her mother's exact posture, shoulders back, chin raised, hands loose at her sides in the classical position for breath control. Even in her maid's uniform, even under these impossible circumstances, she carried herself like royalty preparing for coronation, not execution. The guests were watching with cruel anticipation, waiting for her to fail, to crack under pressure, to prove she was nothing more than a common thief trying to buy time with a desperate gamble. They expected fumbling, off-key warbling, the embarrassing attempt of someone who'd heard opera but never studied it. Dante stood 3 feet away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp with focus. He expected failure too, though something about Isabella's calm unnerved him. She held the microphone like she'd been born to it. like it was an extension of her body rather than a foreign object. There was no trembling, no last-minute panic, no tears. The orchestra reached the moment where the voice should enter, that delicate pause where the singer takes control of the music and transforms it from notes on a page into something transcendent. Giuseppe opened his eyes and looked at Isabella one final time, seeing Lucia's ghost superimposed over her daughter's face. He gave her the smallest nod, a benediction, and a promise. I remember your mother, and I will honor her memory by giving you everything I have. Isabella drew breath deep and controlled, her diaphragm expanding in the precise technique of classical training. Her eyes found Dante's across the stage, and something in her gaze made him unconsciously take a step back. Then Isabella Messina opened her mouth and her mother's voice came flooding back into the world. 20 years dead and newly resurrected. I demanding the justice that had been denied for far too long. The first note that came from Isabella's throat was impossible. It shouldn't have existed in a maid who served champagne and scrubbed floors, shouldn't have emerged from someone who'd spent 7 years making herself invisible. The sound was pure and devastating, carrying across the ballroom with the force of a confession and the beauty of a requiem. It was Lucia Messina's voice. The same crystalline clarity, the same perfect pitch, the same technique that had made her legendary before Antonio Romano destroyed her. But underneath it burned something fiercer, something that had survived when Lucia had not. O mio babino caro, Isabella sang, the Italian flowing like silken razors. Oh my dear papa. The lyrics were a daughter's plea, but Isabella sang them as an accusation, each word landing like a blade between Dante's ribs. She watched his face as she sang, watched the exact moment recognition flickered across his features like lightning before a storm. His gray eyes widened fractionally, his jaw tightened, and his hand moved unconsciously to his chest as if he could feel the ghost of his father's sins pressing against his heart. He was remembering something, a recording perhaps, or a story Antonio had told, or a performance he'd attended as a child. Whatever the memory, it was connecting dots he'd never thought to connect before. The older guests were whispering now, heads bent together in urgent conversation. Giovanni Castellano, who'd been Antonio's consigliere 30 years ago, stood abruptly from his seat, his face pale with shock. Madonna Santa, he breathed. It's not possible. Lucia Messina is dead. But that voice, his wife whispered back. Her hand clutching his arm. Dio mio, that's Lucia's voice. Exactly. How? The name spread through the ballroom like wildfire through dry grass. Messina. Messina. The older generation remembered the scandal, remembered Antonio's obsession, remembered the brilliant young soprano who'd rejected the most powerful man in New York and paid for it with everything she had. The younger generation heard the name and saw their parents' shocked faces and understood they were witnessing something significant, something dangerous, though they didn't yet know why. Isabella poured everything into the performance, 20 years of training that began before she could walk. 7 years of silence and swallowed rage, 3 months of grief since her mother's death. Her voice climbed the aria's crescendo. Each note technically perfect but emotionally devastating. She wasn't just singing about a daughter's love, she was singing about a daughter's vengeance, about justice delayed but not forgotten, about debts that compound over decades until they can only be paid in blood and reckoning. Mi piace, è bello, she sang, hitting the climactic high note with such purity that several guests gasped audibly. I like him. He is handsome. But she was looking at Dante as she sang it, and the words took on new meaning, became a promise and a threat simultaneously. She would marry him as he'd promised. She would stand beside him. She would become everything he'd offered in his moment of cruel jest. And then she would destroy him from within, exactly as his father had destroyed her mother. The seduction had already begun, wrapped in Puccini's genius. Delivered with her mother's voice and her own unbreakable will. Dante stood frozen, understanding flooding through him with terrible clarity. This wasn't a maid. This was Lucia Messina's daughter, trained and patient and carrying vengeance like a crown. The final note hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread, pure and perfect and unbearably beautiful. Isabella held it longer than seemed humanly possible, her breath control flawless, her technique impeccable, before finally letting it fade into silence. The orchestra's last chord dissolved with it, leaving 400 people suspended in a moment where time seemed to have stopped entirely. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence was so complete that Isabella could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could hear the faint rustle of Maestro Giuseppe lowering his baton with trembling hands. Then the spell broke. Thunderous applause erupted from half the room while the other half sat in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. Giovanni Castellano was on his feet, tears streaming down his weathered face, his clapping with the fervor of a man who'd just seen a ghost perform a miracle. Other old-timers joined him, remembering Lucia, understanding that they'd just witnessed not just a performance, but a resurrection, a reckoning, a ghost returning to claim what had been stolen. But Valentina Castelli stood frozen with rage, her perfect face twisted into something ugly. Her father and brothers were already moving towards the exit, recognizing a broken deal when they saw one. Marcella had gone pale as death, understanding that her simple plan to frame a maid had somehow unleashed something catastrophic that she couldn't control. And Dante stood absolutely still, his calculated control shattered like glass against stone. His mind was racing, connecting pieces he should have seen years ago. Isabella Romano, not Romano at all, but Messina. On 7 years in his household, silent and invisible, learning every secret, documenting every weakness. Not a maid, an infiltrator. An enemy who'd gotten closer than anyone ever had, who'd waited with the patience of a saint or a sociopath for exactly this kind of moment. He should have her killed, should have her dragged to the basement and questioned until she revealed every detail of her plan, should eliminate the threat immediately, publicly, as a warning to anyone else who thought they could deceive the Romano family. But 400 witnesses had just heard him make a promise. And Dante Romano's word was the foundation of his empire, the thing that separated him from his father's crude brutality. He kept his promises, even to enemies, especially to enemies. It was the code he'd built his reputation on. And beneath the shock and the recognition of danger, Dante felt something he hadn't expected. Genuine admiration. Isabella had played a perfect game. She'd waited 7 years, had hidden her greatest weapon with absolute discipline, and had turned his own cruel jest into a checkmate he couldn't escape. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. It was the most interesting thing that had happened to him in years. Dante stepped forward, and the applause died away as if cut by a blade. He looked at Isabella, who stood with her chin raised, the microphone still in her hand, her dark eyes meeting his with a mixture of defiance and calculation. She knew he'd figured it out, and she knew he was trapped. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dante said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with absolute authority despite the chaos churning inside him. "First, it seems we have a new arrangement to celebrate." Valentina made a sound like a wounded animal, but Dante ignored her. "Isabella Messina," he said, using her real name deliberately, watching her eyes widen slightly at the confirmation that he knew, "has proven herself beyond any doubt. The engagement stands, effective immediately." He closed the distance between them in 3 strides and extended his hand, not for her to shake but for her to take as a partner, as an equal, as an enemy he was choosing to keep close. Isabella took it, her fingers cool and steady against his palm. "I know exactly what game you're playing," Dante whispered, leaning close enough that only she could hear beneath the erupting chaos. "And I look forward to seeing who destroys whom first." The ballroom descended into controlled chaos as Dante dismissed the guests with a curt gesture to his security team. The Castellis left in a fury of silken threats, Valentina's screaming echoing through the marble halls until the heavy doors cut it off. Other families departed quickly, sensing that whatever was happening between Il Giudice and the maid who wasn't a maid was too dangerous to witness. Within 20 minutes, the glittering celebration had emptied like water from a broken glass, leaving only staff scrambling to clean and a handful of Romano family members whispering in corners. Isabella stood on the stage, still holding the microphone, her body thrumming with adrenaline in the aftermath of performance. She'd done it. She'd revealed herself, had claimed her mother's legacy publicly. He had maneuvered Dante into a position he couldn't escape. But as the reality of what came next settled over her like a weight, she felt the first flicker of doubt. She'd accelerated her timeline by years. She was exposed now, known, no longer invisible. Everything that happened from this moment forward would be exponentially more dangerous. The library. Now. Dante's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. He was already walking away, not checking to see if she followed, simply expecting obedience. Isabella set down the microphone carefully, nodded her thanks to Maestro Giuseppe, who was watching her with tears still wet on his weathered face, and followed Dante through the mansion's corridors. Her heart hammered, but her steps were steady. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing fear. The library was 3 floors up, in a cathedral of leather-bound books and dark wood that smelled of old paper and older money. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Manhattan skyline, the city lights glittering like the diamonds that had adorned the guests who'd just fled. Dante closed the heavy door behind them, and the sound of it clicking shut felt like a cell locking. He turned to face her, leaning back against his massive mahogany desk, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the dim lamplight. For a long moment he just studied her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "Isabella Messina," he said finally. "Daughter of Lucia Messina the soprano my father destroyed 20 years ago. You've been in my house for 7 years, living under a false name, watching, waiting, planning." He paused, letting the words settle between them like stones. "Did you really think I didn't know?" Isabella's blood went cold. It was a bluff. It had to be a bluff. If he'd known, he would have acted months ago, would have eliminated the threat before it could materialize. But she couldn't be certain, and that uncertainty was a weapon he was wielding with precision. "If you knew," Isabella said carefully, "then you're more foolish than I thought. Letting an enemy live under your roof for 7 years. Dante's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Or perhaps I was curious to see how far you'd go, what you'd sacrifice, how patient you could be." He pushed off from the desk, moving closer, a predator closing distance. "Your mother sang beautifully too. My father played me the recordings after she rejected him. He was obsessed with her until the day he died, you know. I called her name in his sleep during those final months." The words were designed to wound, and they did. Isabella's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Your father was a monster who destroyed everything beautiful he couldn't own. He killed my mother as surely as if he'd put a bullet in her brain. Slower, more cruel. I know." Dante's acknowledgement caught her off guard. "My father was many things, and most of them were monstrous. I've spent 5 years trying to reform what he built, trying to make it into something that doesn't require destroying innocence for profit." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, could see the flecks of darker gray in his storm-colored eyes. "But that doesn't absolve me, does it? I still benefit from his crimes. I still carry his name. So tell me, Yar Isabella Messina, what exactly is your plan? Seduce me, poison me, learn my secrets, and sell them to my enemies?" Isabella lifted her chin, refusing to back away from his proximity, refusing to be intimidated in this moment when everything hung in the balance. "I'm going to marry you, as you publicly promised. I'm going to stand beside you as your wife. I'm going to learn every secret of your empire, every vulnerability, every weakness, and then I'm going to burn it all down with you inside it. Slowly, carefully, the way your father burned my mother's life to ashes." The honesty was reckless, dangerous, possibly suicidal, but Isabella was done with deception in this moment, done with pretending. Let him know what she intended. Let him understand the enemy he'd just bound himself to. Dante stared at her for a long moment. And then he did something completely unexpected. He laughed. Not the cruel laughter from the ballroom, but something genuine and almost admiring. "Finally," he said. "Finally, someone interesting. Do you know how boring this world is, Isabella? How predictable. Everyone wants something simple. Money, power, protection. Everyone can be bought or threatened. But you..." He shook his head, something like wonder in his expression. "You want vengeance. You want justice. You want to watch me burn. It's almost refreshing." "This isn't a game," Isabella said through gritted teeth. "Oh, but it is. The most dangerous game either of us will ever play." Dante extended his hand, formal as a business contract, deadly as a snake coiling to strike. "Then let's see who destroys whom first. Isabella Messina. But know this, you'll have to get close enough to kill me, and that proximity works both ways. You might find that the man you're trying to destroy isn't the monster you've built him up to be in your mind, and that might be the most dangerous thing of all." Isabella stared at his offered hand, understanding that taking it meant committing fully to this war, meant accepting that she might not survive what came next. But she'd come too far to back down now. She'd promised her mother, and promises to the dead were the most binding of all. She took his hand, her grip firm and steady, and felt the electricity of mutual recognition. Two predators acknowledging each other, two enemies beginning a dance that could only end with one of them destroyed. "I won't fall for you," Isabella said quietly. "I won't forget what your family took from me." "We'll see," Dante replied, and there was something in his eyes that made her shiver despite herself. "We'll see." In the shadows outside the library door, Marcella Romano pressed herself against the wall, her heart racing as she listened to the conversation filtering through the heavy wood. She'd followed them, hoping to salvage something from the disaster she'd created. The necklace was still hidden in her apartment, waiting to be sold to pay her debts. But that seemed laughably irrelevant now. She tried to frame a simple maid for theft, and instead she'd unleashed a vendetta 20 years in the making, had given Dante's true enemy direct access to everything he held dear. The Genovese family would have to wait for their money. Marcella had bigger problems now. Because if Dante ever discovered her role in accelerating Isabella's timeline, enforcing this confrontation before either of them was ready, he wouldn't just kill her. He'd make her wish death would come. She slipped away through the darkened corridors, already planning her next move in a game that had suddenly become far more complex and far more deadly than anyone had anticipated. In the library, Dante and Isabella stood with their hands still clasped, sealing an engagement that felt more like a declaration of war. Outside the windows, New York glittered and burned, indifferent to the battle about to unfold in its darkest corners. And somewhere in the mansion, the ghost of Lucia Messina smiled because her daughter had finally begun the reckoning that had been promised 20 years ago. The war had begun.